Sarah Rogerson is the Director of Assessment at Oxford University Press, where she is responsible for a suite of formative and summative assessments, such as the Oxford Placement Test and the Oxford Test of English. Sarah has been in English language teaching, has been in English language teaching and assessment since 1999, when she moved from the UK to Taiwan to teach young learners. I'm not sure I understand this bit in brackets. The bit that young learners is the best job ever. Well, probably a right speaker for today then. Sarah loves meeting teachers and students and learning and finding out all about their context and how Oxford University Press can support them. So bring in ELTOC Chapter 5 to a close. Our final speaker, Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sean. That was quite the intro. Delighted to be here as the final speaker of ELTOC 2023. So fantastic to see all the love in the chat box. It's really nice to see the whole world essentially represented in the chat box here today. As Sean said, my name's Sarah Rogerson. I'm the Director of Assessment at OUP. And I'm going to be talking about effective assessment in the primary classroom. I saw bits of the previous presentation and the video that was about music in the primary classroom, and that took me back to my kindergarten teaching days and really put a smile on my face. And I hope you all enjoyed that talk as well. So I'm going to start at the end today, and I'm going to start by telling you what you're going to know at the end of this session. So these are my wrap-up points. These are the final points I'm going to make today. The first one is make learning visible. The second one is assessment of learning and assessment for learning. Aren't that different? The third one is there is no point in assessment without feedback. And the fourth one is use different kinds of assessment to get the best out of your students. So they are the key points from today's talk. Hopefully you'll stay with me to hear why those are the key points, but I wanted to start by summarizing really what you're going to learn in today's session. So before we start, Sean mentioned the best job ever. And I shouldn't really say that working for OUP in case my manager's watching. But this was me a long time ago in a kindergarten classroom in Taiwan, where I stayed for 7 years teaching kindergarten. Full high energy, lots of creativity, lots of really fantastic, talented students who didn't really know they were learning English, but were just there having fun and having a really, really great time. And it was the best job ever because every day I saw smiling faces. Every day I saw people who really, really wanted to be there, who wanted to be with me, wanted to be playing games, singing songs, and doing all the things that you do with kindergarten and pre-K children that really support them in language learning. But even though it was my best job, I had some problems. And I think looking back, these were my 5 problems. Providing feedback to parents was a problem. When you're in a classroom teaching kindergarten or primary school children, parents want to know what's going on. And I think that's fine. I'm a parent. I want to know what's going on in my kids' classroom. I found it quite difficult sometimes to demonstrate that progress was happening because progress is such a vague term. And sometimes you make progress and then you go backwards a little bit. So how can you demonstrate that progress is happening? I found it difficult sometimes to provide different lessons to different needs. So maybe I've got a class of 15, 20, 30 students, and they're all primary students, but some of them maybe have been raised in a bilingual background and some of them maybe haven't. Some of them have learning difficulties and some of them haven't. So they've all got different, unique skills that they bring into the classroom. And I remember finding it difficult to create the class, to create the lesson plan where everybody was able to be engaged. Sometimes I found it difficult to make learning fun, especially at the beginning of my teaching career, because at the beginning of the teaching career, I just wanted to do the right thing and follow the lesson plan and make sure that everybody was on track. And sometimes you forget the fun element, and fun is the most important part of learning in those days. And then the final problem I had was getting students talking. Getting primary students using the language sometimes was a bit of a challenge for me. So these were my problems. And I wanted to ask you via a poll, which of these do you experience as your biggest challenge when teaching primary students? So there should be a poll coming up right now. You just select the one that you think was your biggest challenge. And I'll check that. I can see the results of that poll. I'm not sure. Everybody's, oh, there, the results are coming through. So I can see right now that the biggest challenge for people in this room was providing feedback to parents and demonstrating progress. At the moment, we've got 14% of you find it difficult providing feedback to parents, 12% find it difficult demonstrating progress, 35%, wow, that is a big number, find it difficult to differentiate the lessons, 13% find it difficult to make learning fun, and 27% find it difficult to get students talking. So that's quite heartwarming for me to see, because they were my problems, and I'm not unique as an individual. We all have the same problems as educators sometimes. And as I look back now with the experience that I have of working in assessment for 15 years, I can say that the answers to some of these problems is really being able to do effective assessment. I know that now. I didn't know it then. I was just a young graduate trying her best in the classroom, really. And that leads me on to the first quote of this talk today, which is that a solid understanding of assessment should be a part of every teacher's learning base. So I had all of these problems at the time. I didn't know much about assessment. I thought it was just tests. But now looking back, I know that I could have solved some of these problems, especially around progress and feedback to parents, if I'd have known a little bit more about assessment. And hopefully that's what I'm going to impart to some of you today. And I'm sure you'll know a lot of what I'm going to say, but sometimes just making it visible, making it transparent, solidifies some of that knowledge. So I want you to now write in the chat box, what do you think of when you think about assessment? Because, you know, there is so much in the word assessment. Sometimes it is a big word, right? It encapsulates so many things, and it can be quite chaotic sometimes because there are lots of words related to assessment. You'll go to lots of talks about assessment. This is one. And you'll hear lots of different terminology, and you'll hear lots about the science behind assessment and what makes good assessment. But I'm just interested to know what you think of when you think about assessment. And there's lots of comments coming through. Complex. Somebody wrote complex, right? That's what I'm trying to say, is assessment can seem complex. We've got people writing about measuring learning, evaluation, feedback, progress, stress. I missed the name there, but stress is really a word that can be associated with assessment. And hopefully in this talk, I'm going to try and de-stress some kinds of assessment a little bit. Assessment should be appropriate. That's a really great point. Thank you for writing that, because that's one of my key beliefs. I really believe in assessment for good, is what I call it. Making sure that whenever we do assessment, it's having a positive impact and doing what we intend it to do. Thank you for all the engagement in the chat. There's a lot of you there. Somebody just wrote afraid of failure. And I'll give you my personal anecdote about this, which used to fill me with shame, but doesn't anymore because I'm fully grown up. But I failed my driving test 10 times. Makes people laugh when I tell them. Not many people have failed their driving test that many times. And I failed my driving test in 3 continents. So I've done really, really well at failing. And it got to the point where I was afraid to fail. And that in itself made me fail. The nerves, the stress. So I really understand a lot about the stress of assessment. So let's move on, because what we're going to talk about today and focus on today are 2 lenses of assessment. I'm going to try and clear away all of the other noise around assessment, around evaluation, around progress, around pre-testing, practice testing, integrated learning. And we're going to look through 2 lenses. We're going to look through the lens of assessment for learning and assessment of learning. And hopefully you know what some of those mean. And if you don't, let's just have a quick pause and talk about what we think those mean. So assessment for learning has a key difference. It's the little word for, and assessment of learning, you know, there's that little word of. And generally speaking, we think of formative assessment, the kind of assessment that informs learning, as being assessment for learning. And assessment of learning, generally we think of summative assessment. I'm just seeing somebody else who seems to have similar driving test failures as me, a kindred spirit out there. So these are the two lenses that we're going to look through today when we're talking about assessment in the primary classroom. And we're going to start by talking a little bit about assessment for learning. And what I'm hoping to do is really give you some solid ideas that you can use in the classroom today, tomorrow, around assessment for learning. Then we'll give you some top tips on assessment of learning in the primary classroom. And I'd encourage you to share any other ideas that you have in the chat, because you are the true experts here when it comes to primary assessment. A lot of you are teachers. I'm not a teacher anymore. I haven't been in the classroom for a long, long time, except as an observer. So I'm going to share some ideas, which is hopefully going to start a conversation that you can have with your colleagues and that you can have with your peers. So let's have a little look at assessment for learning. And I'm going to show you another diagram. And this diagram has learning intentions down one side, success criteria down the other side, and diagnostics down the other side. And then we've got feedback in the beginning, in the middle of it. And people often say that this is assessment for learning, in that to make learning visible, that's one of our objectives today, to make learning visible, your students need to know what you're intending them to learn, right? They also need to know, what does good look like? That's success criteria. And you have some kind of diagnostics here. You need to find out what they know. And you find out what they know by creating questions, quizzes, activities, where you're really focusing on making sure that your students have feedback that is based on learning intentions and success criteria and diagnostics. And people often think this is assessment for learning, and it is, to be honest, but it's also, I also think it's not very different to assessment of learning if you replace learning intentions with testing intentions, but we'll get back to that a little bit later. The key point today of this talk is one of the key takeaways really for you is to think about feedback and how you deliver feedback, and make sure that your feedback is based on learning intentions and success criteria, and that through diagnostics you are finding out what your students know so that you can help them drive learning forwards. And this is all part of making learning visible. It's the really key thing that I would like you to think about today. John Hattie coined this phrase, make learning visible. And I think it's really important at all ages and at all contexts that students know what you're intending them to learn. And you can do that by learning intentions and success criteria, and then really having some solid tools of diagnostics so you know what your what your students do know and are able to give appropriate feedback. I think sometimes as teachers, maybe learning isn't that visible. Maybe it's visible to us. Maybe we know exactly what we intend students to learn. But if the students don't know what we intend them to learn, then it can cause a little bit of confusion and friction. So by learning intentions and by giving clear success criteria, we can really make learning visible. And let's have a look at this. This is an example from Beehive. I know you've had a look at Beehive today. Hopefully that's big enough for you and you've got this on full screen. But this is just an example of how learning is made visible in our course books. So if you look at this slide, what do you think the learning intention is? What are we saying to students? This is what we want you to do. I've just seen a question about how to make learning visible. And hopefully through the next few slides, Chris, you'll see what I mean by making learning visible. Because if you look at this slide here, there's a little guy at the top with a box, and it says, let's talk about what we can and can't do. That is the learning intention. So straight away, thank you, Andrea, straight away, students know what we are intending them to learn. And you'll see this in every course book. It's not that groundbreaking, but I think it's important to show you why it's been designed that way. Because we are saying, here is the learning intention. And then the success criteria on this slide you can see in the little cartoon box below, you can see people demonstrating what good looks like. I can do this, I can't do that. And this is a really good example of primary content that's been designed specifically for primary students. Context appropriate, right? It's about sports. But where we're really making learning visible. We're showing what we intend you to learn. Okay, today, kids, we're going to learn can and can't. We're going to learn the modal verb can. And we're also going to show you what good looks like. You're not going to be confused. Okay, you know what we're intending you to do. And then when we give feedback, we're not going to be giving feedback on anything other than the student's ability to use can and can't, because that is the learning intention. And I think if you then confuse that feedback, and if you start correcting the student's use of plural nouns or first, second person, you're kind of confusing the student there, because what we want them to do is use can and can't. And we want to give them feedback on their ability to use can and can't so that they are confident in using that and then can move on to the next learning intention. So learning intentions and success criteria are the key way of making learning visible. And it's a key part of assessment for learning. So I can see Madeline said, the student made posters. That's a really nice idea. And then if we move on, this is more an assessment of learning approach, right? It's a bit more of a formal sit down test, but we've still got the testing intention here. And if you can see the slide, the testing intention here is to, it's really small for me. I'm just going to make it big screen. The testing intention here is you're having a birthday party. So you need to write a reply to Sam and use about 30 words. And the success criteria are the success criteria are good organization, give necessary information to the reader, and use accurate grammar and vocabulary. So this is a way of making learning or testing visible in a more assessment of learning approach. You can see quite clearly that this assessment or this quiz or whatever you want to call it has been very carefully designed around an intention. This is what we want you to do, and a success criteria. And this is what we're going to mark you on doing. And at that point, it enables us to give really solid feedback again. And the key of all of this is feedback. We're giving feedback on the success criteria. We're not giving feedback on anything else. Because for primary students and students at a low level, you could give feedback all day. You could red pen their work all day. But if you just focus on a few key areas, it's going to build the students' motivation and engagement and really make sure that you can give feedback to parents on the progress of the students against these success criteria. And that was one of the problems we spoke about at the beginning. How do we give feedback to parents? How do we define progress? So this is another way of doing showing learning/testing intentions and success criteria in an assessment of learning approach. So this is the whole point of this, which is coming up in a second, is the second key point that I want you to take away today is assessment for learning and assessment of learning really aren't that different. People talk about them as though they're fields apart and they're different ends of the spectrum, but they're really not that different. It's what you're doing with the feedback. It's what you're doing with the data that comes out of that. The key point is that we need to make it clear to students what we want them to learn. And we're going to do that with learning intentions. And we're going to show them what good looks like via success criteria. And that's what we're going to give feedback against. Which takes me to the second takeaway today. So at the beginning, I spoke about all of those things that I wanted you to take away from today. And the second takeaway is assessment of learning and assessment for learning aren't that different. So it's not a clear science. I hope that's clear so far. I'm going to take a little bit of a breather, have a sip of water because I've been talking quite a lot. Okay. Key takeaway number 2, assessment of learning and assessment for learning aren't that different. So with that in mind, let's look at some top tips in assessment for learning. Okay, these are top tips that you will see throughout OUP materials, and I'll be using Beehive again as an example. And please share in the chat any other tips that you might have. And so my top tips for assessment of learning are practice effective feedback, because feedback is key to it. Give continual feedback. And I saw in the chat somebody spoke about giving continual assessment. Continual feedback is really important. Practice peer assessment and practice self-assessment. These are four really good things that you can take away tomorrow and put in your classroom to support assessment for learning in the primary classroom. In terms of practicing effective feedback, OUP, there's a link that's going to come up to a position paper, and OUP have 7 clear directives for giving effective feedback. The first one is feedback needs to be specific and clear. Second one is feedback needs to be well timed. The third one, we've been talking about this a lot today, is it needs to be linked to learning and success criteria. The fourth one is you need to focus on the task, not the learner. I think this is incredibly important because sometimes we talk about the individual rather than the work that they've done, and we really don't want to focus on the individual. There's a piece on learning cues. The next one is strategies, not solutions. So it's kind of like, you know, this is about the teaching a man to fish thing, really. What we don't want to do is correct every piece of work for the student. We want to give them those solutions to do it themselves, those strategies to do it themselves. And the final one is feedback should be actionable and achievable. So at the beginning, I said that teachers really need to know about assessment, and I'm sure you would all agree with that. And if you go to that position paper, which is freely available to download, you'll be able to read a lot more about how to integrate effective feedback in your classroom. Pretty said self-assessment is important to find the level of learning, and it absolutely is. And I'm sure you all agree with that. Self-assessment is also really important to build the individual, to allow the individual to thrive and to become a lifelong learner, which is something that we all want. And Safa is asking about washback. And washback, we think of, if you don't know what washback is, it's the effect of assessment on the student. And we think about it as positive washback and negative washback. And positive washback is the kind of effect on the student that makes them want to do more, right? That the assessment's been assessment for learning has a positive washback because it's aimed at creating lifelong learners. But the negative washback is if you just do test and test and test and test and test and test every single day, then all of those words that we spoke about at the beginning around stress and fear of failure, that is the negative washback. And I think when you think about feedback, there's some really good statistics that show the impact of positive feedback, of feedback used well. And feedback used well can save 5 months out of the school year, because that's how much extra learning the student's going to gain. So you cannot go wrong by learning more and more about how to give effective feedback. On the other hand, feedback can also take learning backwards. And I think we all want to avoid taking learning backwards. So that's about feedback. The second thing I said was about continual feedback. And what you'll see in the student's book in OUP, in Beehive, is this 2 stars and a wish. Are you familiar with 2 stars and a wish? I'm sure some of you are, others might not be. This is a way of giving continual feedback to your students on a daily basis, which is taking learning forwards. So the 2 stars, the teacher's telling you 2 positive, Yasmin saying feedback must be positive. Thank you, Yasmin. There are two things that you've done really well today. I think Beatrice knows as well, 2 stars and a wish. And the wish is one thing that we want you to do better. And this is so simple, right? It's just a simple thing that you can print out and give to your students every lesson. But it's a way of saying, you're really great. You're doing these 2 things really well. And it can be anything, right? Even if this is a student that is not particularly achieving much academically, you know, you can give them a star for their engagement, for their motivation, for being a good, a kind human being to their body, whatever. You can give them that that praise, which is going to build their confidence. Confidence is absolutely crucial. But the wish is we're focusing on one specific thing that we want that person to do better. And again, that could be anything. That could be about grammar or pronunciation, but it could also be, next lesson, I want you to really focus on helping this other person who I'm going to place you with. So 2 stars and a wish is a really good way of doing continual feedback. And then when he spoke about peer assessment, 2 stars and a wish again. But this time you've got your teacher saying the 2 stars and a wish and your friend saying 2 stars and a wish. And I'm going to pause here because Blanca says, when do you write 2 stars and the wish? At the end of the session? And RB, I'm not sure what that stands for, has said just for completing the task. Well, I thought that was maybe an answer to Blanca's question, but I don't think it is. But I think the 2 stars and a wish is at the end of a session. Okay, at the end of your lesson, when you're looking through what the student's done for the day or for homework at any time that it feels appropriate, but it's at an end of a period of learning, incorporate that 2 stars and a wish into it. And I think, this one, which is about peer assessment. Do you use peer assessment in your classrooms? Can anyone tell me about any success stories you have had in terms of peer assessment? Because I think it can be quite a challenging thing for some teachers, because as teachers, peer assessment is kind of giving away the control in a way, and it's allowing students to grade each other and to feedback against each other. And I can see that there's a lot of people who do use peer assessment in the classroom sometimes, but it is a very, very powerful tool, because again, there's always research that shows something, right? But there's research that shows that students learn much better from each other than they do from a teacher, and that is a really important thing. So Erica says, no, I work with kindergarten students, I can't do that. And probably, depending on the language level, you can't, but there's no reason this feedback couldn't be in the first language. I hope we're moving away from the only speak English all the time in the classroom, because the feedback that you can give your students in the first language might be a little bit meaningful sometimes. And having your kindergarten students give each other feedback in the first language is going to be valuable as well. And I can see there's a lot of people in the chat. Thank you so much for your engagement, by the way. It's really, it's really lovely to see, because when you're given this kind of talk, you just stare into a screen, and it's really nice to see there are real people at the other end of the screen. So peer assessment is important, and you can incorporate it quite easily by just trying out a tool like this. And somebody said, yeah, they take it more seriously. And I think they probably do. It's like you do, even as an adult, I probably listen to what my friends say more than I listen to what my dad says. So it's the same kind of thing. And then there's another example of self-assessment here. And, this was, if we go back to kind of learning intentions. So I'm just reading the chat, and there's some really excellent tips. So I hope you're all kind of involved in the chat, because as Paulina says, peer assessment is less stressful for students. So this is just a self-assessment checklist at the end of Unit 3 of a particular course book. Again, it's Beehive, because we love bees at OUP. And you've got a list of things, and you're asking your students to grade themselves, right? I can talk about activities. Am I going to give myself 1 tick, 2 ticks, or 3 ticks? And then I'm going to describe my effort. How hard am I trying? Am I trying a little bit, or am I trying really hard? And here's why this is important. This is really important because of the conversation that that comes out of it, right? So if your student is grading themselves a 1 tick on I can talk about activities, but you think that student is doing really well there and they're a 3 tick, you can have that conversation with your student and really encourage them and let them know how well they are doing. And conversely, If the student gives themselves 3 ticks and you think they're 1 tick, again, it allows you to have a conversation. And this kind of conversation is absolutely crucial to making learning visible. And on the effort side, I'm sure you've all got people in your class who maybe don't put in effort sometimes, right? I have 2 kids, twins, 10-year-old twins. One of them tries hard all the time, and the other one really doesn't put the effort in, because we're all wonderful, unique human beings who do things differently and put different amounts of pressure on ourselves. And I think by having a conversation and having your students actually describe how much effort they're putting in, it makes it a little bit clear to them, and again gives them an opportunity to have that conversation with you. And I can see there's somebody in the chat who says they don't have a lot of time for assessment. And I think that's a really good point. I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. I'm going to say Nguyen. But everything in the classroom is assessment. So you might not have a lot of time for formal assessment, but this kind of thing at the end of a class, asking concept checking questions, these are all kinds of assessment, which is why assessment is such a broad term. So self-assessment, another great way. And Safa says students can assess their own learning at the end of a learning unit, and that's what this is really trying to say. Okay, let's move on. Oh, moved on too quickly. And here is another type of self-assessment with maybe a more advanced level class, or a different time of the course. Could be maybe you do this quarterly or every term or something. And here they're writing the lesson objective, they're describing their effort, and they're describing how they could improve, how they could do better. Okay, so we looked at the previous example, which is maybe for a younger student, and this one could be for a little bit of an older student. So you're kind of covering the age spectrum when it comes to primary here, because your 10-year-old might be able to do this, might find this a little bit more appropriate for them than the slide with the bees on. So again, it's just the same kind of thing, really. Making learning visible. What was my learning intention? What was the lesson objective? How hard did I try? And what could I do better next time? And again, this is making learning visible and helping drive learning forwards. I saw an interesting comment that said peer assessment might bring some self-shame. And I think that is a really, really important comment, because you don't want students to be embarrassed. You don't want that kind of thing to happen. So I think it's about your culture as a classroom. How do you operate as a classroom? Do you have a classroom charter which describes the kind of behavior that you want to have? Because the last thing I would want is students to feel ashamed because of a peer's feedback. So it's all about how you do this feedback, the kind of culture that you instill in your classroom, and the kind of behaviors from students. And of course, students are always going to want feedback from their teacher as well. And you can only give them so much feedback. You only have so much time. But by assessing themselves and assessing others, they're then getting more and more feedback. So none of this is about shame. This is just about new ideas for you to use in the classroom, and none of these are obligatory. These are ideas for you to use with your students if you think it's appropriate in your context. So the third point here, and I really loved this this image. It says feedback comes from someone who sees something you don't. How great is that? Because lots of us aren't maybe that self-aware about our positives and negatives. And so feedback is the way that we're going to learn about that. So there is no point in assessment without feedback. And that is, for me, the most important thing about assessment. Do not assess without giving feedback to your students, because there's no point in it. They're just sitting there writing on a piece of paper. They're not getting any feedback from it. That's not driving learning forwards. It's wasting your time and it's wasting their time. So, when you talk about feedback, you can talk to your students about why it's important by saying, well, you don't see everything, but I can see things that you don't maybe necessarily see. And as Latifa says, feedback does motivate. Right, let's look at some top tips in assessment of learning. So this is the more summative style. And my top tips, and this is where what I know the most about, because this is my job, right? My job is making assessment of learning style tests. So it's let students know how they will be assessed, or let students know what they will be assessed on. Show students what you're marking against. Provide students with the why, that's a meaningful score, and explore different ways to assess. Okay, so what is really important, we talked at the beginning about learning intentions. We need to show students what they're going to be assessed on. So let's have a look at that. For Oxford Test of English, which is my kind of baby, this is my job, we make sure that if you're going to do this kind of test, which is more of a formal test, we make sure that students know what to expect. So you can go online, you can see the test specifications, you can see how many questions you're going to be asked, you can see on the reading test what the learning testing intentions are for each part of the reading test. For the speaking test, you know exactly what you've got to do. So we are showing exactly to the students what we are going to assess on. And that is important for any kind of assessment of learning test, because if your student goes into the classroom and they don't know what they're going to be tested on, it can cause a lot of anxiety. We're trying to remove those levels of anxiety, and it can also mean they're not going to perform their best, and we want them to perform their best. So that's the first one. Make sure we know what they're going to be tested on. And the second one is show them the mark schemes, show them what the success criteria is. Every major test, and I'm talking about certificated tests too, but you will use tests in your classroom, have a mark scheme for speaking and writing that says, if you use this kind of grammar, you're going to get a medium score. And if you use this kind of grammar, you're going to get a high score. And that enables students to know where to focus their time. Clearly, this is probably for a higher primary school age, but it's really, really important. And the third thing is give them a meaningful score. This is an example of the Oxford Test of English certificate again, but you will have different kinds of meaningful scores in your class. If the score is 40 or B or C, I think it's hard for a lot of people to know what that means. This meaningful score comes in terms of a certification, in terms of level, and in terms of module scores. And I'm showing you this because I think what we do quite well is give this level of feedback at the module level. So if you see it says speaking in the middle, and then you've got the CFR, A2, B1, B2, it's showing people who have taken this test, the Oxford Test of English for Schools, exactly where they are within a CFR band. So that feedback is really, really meaningful. That's something that's going to help drive learning forwards. And then the final part that I'm going to talk about today, and I'm going to talk for probably another 3 minutes, and then I'm totally happy to take whatever questions that you have, is assess in different ways. When we think about tests or assessment of learning, we think about tests. I'm sure you've done a lot of tests in your life. I did a lot of tests at school. I'm not sure many people like tests, but maybe we overuse them somewhat, and maybe we overuse them because that's what we had in our education, and maybe we overuse them because they're quite easy to do. But I think it's important that in assessment of learning, we look at assessing in different ways. It doesn't need to be a test. You can think differently about assessment of learning. We can give the main point of assessment is to collect evidence that progress has been made. So alternative assessment tools could be a portfolio, could be an observation. We could be talking about peer and self-assessment again in assessment of learning, or it could be project-based assessment. I'm going to give you some examples of what this might look like. I'm sure you've used them in your classroom as well. So this is project work, okay? And I've got a link here if you want to find out more about project work at teachingenglish.org.uk. There's an article there about project work for teachers. This could very easily be assessment for or assessment of learning, depending what stage you do it. So imagine the scenario. You've been teaching a B2 level class on the topic of the environment. You want to get information on how well the class have engaged with the vocabulary. so that you can give feedback to parents, right? And so this is very much assessment of learning. We're doing it at the end of a period of time. We want to know how well they've engaged with the vocabulary. We need to write a report for parents. Fairly familiar scenario. So what you might choose to do is to give them a vocabulary pop quiz, right? But if you do that a lot, you might also choose to think, how could I do this differently? So you could ask students to work in groups using Zoom or Teams or in the classroom, whatever way you're teaching, to prepare a presentation about ways that families can reduce their environmental impact. They're going to be using the vocabulary. You're going to see how well they've engaged, but also you're practicing the key skills of collaboration, global skills, real life use of English, and it's incredibly engaging. And you give them feedback on that. You know, the learning intention is use this vocabulary I've taught you. And the success criteria is the vocabulary you've taught them, but they're working together. So it's extending that learning and it's making it less stressful, I think. I'm sure you use Kahoots, but this is just a different way of making the assessment of learning type quizzes a little bit more engaging, using technology that students often have in their pockets. So this is just about doing mobile quizzes, and you can do mobile quizzes on everything. In this example, I've put about present simple conjugations, but if you do a pen and paper quiz, great. If you do Kahoot, it enables you to get feedback instantly on the whiteboard so that you can see how your students are doing and that you can focus your energy on where the biggest problems are. So that's another way of doing assessment of learning. YouTube for Kids is out there. You can use video presentations for assessment of learning. Instead of asking we spoke a little bit about shy students and anxiety before. If you want to review speaking skills, sometimes we ask a student to stand in front of the class and talk to the whole class and give a presentation about whatever subject you want to give them. That is stressful. I remember doing that at school quite a lot. But if you give students, let them access the technology that they're used to and allow them to create a video presentation at home, clearly on a private YouTube channel, then you get to see their speaking performance. You get them to be using 21st century skills, self-learning, but you also get to you also get to de-stress the classroom. I think Chris says Kahoot is good for feedback about kids, but not for assessment of students. I think, Chris, we can use it for both quite easily, and it's really about how you integrate it into the classroom. And just moving on, one more. That's the final takeaway. Use different kinds of assessment to get the best out of your students. And go in here. This is my first slide. Hopefully I've done what I said I would do. Hopefully I've spoken about how you can make learning visible. Hopefully I've described of learning and assessment for learning different. Hopefully you know takeaways that there's no point in assessment without feedback. So really download that position paper and really look at how to give effective feedback. And hopefully you've got a takeaway about how to use different kinds of assessment to get the best out of your students. I'm very aware that there's a lot of information in this session today. I always like to make sure that there's something for everybody because there's thousands of people from all over the world. And Chris has got another question. Chris, really thanks for your engagement today. You've got some really great ideas. Audio rather than video. Absolutely, audio rather than video if that's what's appropriate for your students. At the age of primary age students, it depends on where they are, what they enjoy, their own identity. So you can decide what works for you. That's maybe that should have been a crucial takeaway is make sure that it works for you and in your classroom and in your context, because a lot of this is very cultural. So I'm happy to ask any questions that people might have. Ask any question, answer any questions that people might have.
You can ask the questions if you want, Sarah. I know if the audience wants to answer them. But if you click on the Q&A tab, you will find a number of questions waiting for you. There are lots. You've probably got just over 10 minutes to answer questions.
Okay.
And you might need to scroll a little bit to see them all.
Thanks, Sean. I'll scroll a little bit to see them all. So Sarah says, do you allow students to use mobile phones in the classroom? I would like to ask the people on the call whether they allow students to use mobile phones in the classroom, or I give my opinion, because remember, I'm not a teacher anymore. I think, there's little point in fighting technology that's available, and that we should be using technology that students have access to ensure that technology is appropriately integrated into the classroom. Now, clearly, you do not want a class of 10-year-olds playing Roblox for the entire session, because I know that's what my kids would do. But there might be times, if it's age appropriate, if your students do have phones, there might be times when you do allow them to use phones, because what you want to create is effective users of English. And when they go into the real world, they're going to be using their mobile phone. You're not gonna, it's not gonna not happen, right? And so, for me, if I was teaching today, I would use mobile phones at the right moment for activities that support learning in the classroom. Clearly, there's a digital divide, and this is very much dependent on affordability of technology, the socioeconomic status of your students. If I wouldn't be doing it in countries where only a couple of people have mobile phones. I wouldn't want people to be thinking badly of themselves because they couldn't afford that technology. But if it was appropriate, I would be integrating into the classroom. I can see from the chat, lots of people can't use phones in the classroom. Lots of people don't use phones in the classroom, and some people do. So I think it's just, I really am about integrating technology into the classroom where possible. So for me, I would. I'm just going to scroll through the questions. How can I make learning fun for students? Can you give specific suggestions? That's from Dita. Again, let's throw this open to the chat. And people can give their own ideas about how you can make learning fun for students in the classroom. I will tell you my ideas of how I used to make learning fun in the classroom. I used to teach kids from 3 to 5 years old, sometimes 7 years old. And I just used to play a lot of games. That was how I made learning fun in the classroom. Because we played games, we played songs, we did stories. We did this thing every day called exercise time, where we just all kind of sang songs and did quite vigorous dancing together. And that's how I did it. But it has to be what's appropriate for you and for your students and for what they enjoy. I just used to do a lot of flashcard games for 3-year-olds. There was this big inflatable hammer, and I'd just throw the cards on the floor and get them to bang whichever card was appropriate for what I was calling out. Daniel says he uses project-based learning in the classroom to make learning fun. I think there are so many ways that you can do it. And when we think about, we had the mobile phone question, but when you think about more digital games, like I said, I don't teach anymore, but we do know that students enjoy video games, and there's no reason why you couldn't incorporate them for homework or in the classroom if you want to. You could have a Minecraft world set up for people to interact together, so and take on project-based learning in English via Minecraft. Roberta says, I always use flashcards to play, in capital letters, so that's clearly very important to Roberta. And honestly, for everything I've said about digital, you can't beat flashcards with primary age students. It's old technology, but it works, and there's so much you can do with flashcards. It looks as though in the chat, lots of people play games with their students. Hamed's talking about Kahoot and Answer Garden. Word searches are coming up, interactive games, flashcards, games, and songs. So, Dita, I hope that answers your question. There's so many ways of making learning fun, but what you can't do is just have your kids just run riot in the classroom. Like, there has to be design behind the activities that you're doing, right? Because I spoke about flashcards and the hammer, right? There's pedagogical reason behind that. I wanted to focus on vocabulary. I wanted people to become a bit faster with vocabulary, and I wanted to make it fun. So it's about designing games around your learning intentions as well. Maria says using QR codes is quite fun. and Yvonne is talking about word wall. So hopefully you've got some ideas about how we can make learning fun in the classroom. I am just looking through the questions again. I'm gonna go. I keep on skipping through the questions wrong. I'm gonna look at Diane's question. How often should I give feedback to parents? Happy for people to give their own comments on that in the chat again. Well, I give you my view, and again, my view is it's age dependent, it's cultural dependent, and it's dependent on what your school wants, because some schools have very strict guidelines about how often you should give feedback to parents, right? So that's the first port of call. What do you have to do? And then the second thing to think about is what's meaningful and what's appropriate for the age of your students and the level of your students. I would be trying to give feedback probably every month. And when I was teaching, what I used to do is write in the parents book every month and give feedback to the parents on each student. Now this was possible for me because I had a class of 15. So, you know, sitting down once a month and writing some feedback to parents based on their child, it is fine. But it's really context specific. Lama says, in our culture, parents want to hear that their children are always doing well. And that can again be a challenge, because doing well is quite vague. Doing well against what? And what I've spoken about today in terms of learning intentions and success criteria will enable you to give that feedback to parents that is quite specific about what the student's doing well. If you're just talking about their ability and in the English language, that's way too broad. So when giving feedback to parents, to make sure that they are getting the feedback that's culturally appropriate for them, I think it's also really important to align it to the learning intentions and success criteria. So I think there's probably time for one more question, and I'm going to nip back to the chat box. There was a question that interested me. I mean, all the questions interest me, don't get me wrong. But Lama said, how can we make assessment more enjoyable and not dreadful? And that, I think, is a really good question to end on, because everything I've spoken about today has been to try and make assessment more enjoyable and not dreadful. Assessment shouldn't be dreadful. Assessment is a part of the teaching tool. It should be in every classroom every day. And if you think of assessment as pen and paper tests, then it's not going to be enjoyable. It might feel a bit dreadful. I know that's an extreme word, but it might do. But if you focus on some of the things that we've spoken about today in terms of assessment of learning, in terms of different ways to assess, in terms of making sure that your assessments align to success criteria and learning intentions, then I think you can make assessment more enjoyable. It's very much down to the teacher often and how you see assessment. And one concern I have, I think, is that as teachers, we have all been taught. I was taught 30 years ago. And that is my model for teaching, right? That is my model for good teaching. But the world has moved on a little bit. And I think we need to make sure that we are evolving our teaching beyond what we had, because what we had isn't the gold standard anymore, because technology has moved on, life has moved on, society has moved on. So I think about assessment in different terms, and you will definitely make it more enjoyable. Okay, so I'm going to draw the session to an end today. I wanted to thank everybody for their engagement, for their time, for taking time out on a Saturday to listen about primary assessment. I hope you've each taken one thing away. I know there's always a lot of information, and I hope you've had a great ELTOC, and that we'll see you next year. So thank you, everybody, and I'll speak soon. Thanks,
Thank you very much, Sarah. Yeah, you're right. It's about our models of teaching needing to evolve to keep up with the way that technology is changing. And I guess one thing, probably a different talk completely, but with assessment, I'm sure chat GPT and chat
yes,
is the next big thing. It was interesting when people saying, are they using do people use mobiles in the classroom? But at the university, of course, we're having a discussion of whether we're going to be allowing to use chat GPT in assessment, their assessment. So it'll be interesting to see in a year's time where we are with that and where
absolutely.
technology goes. But you're right, it was a very engaged audience. Lots of you gave lots of information, but the audience gave lots of information as well. It was a great partnership. Thank you so much, Sarah. Always a pleasure to see you and listen to you talk.